NFL Combine testing is underway here in Indianapolis for the 2024 NFL Combine. Reactions to some of the top performers last night, plus some whispers from Indy here on Locked On NFL Scouting.
You are Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes, your daily podcast for NFL and college football scouting. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is better than this? It's a guy being a dude here on the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast. I'm Kyle Krabs, usually joined by Joe Marino. Joe Marino off today, recovering from all of the strenuous activity of last night's 2024 NFL Combine. But I'm here in Indy, so I have got you covered with all of the action and our initial knee-jerk reaction. NFL Combine testing is kind of right in our wheelhouse. So welcome to Locked On NFL Scouting. I am solo today, Kyle Krabs, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Today's episode of Locked On NFL Scouting is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And the league calendar year is about to get started here in less than 2 weeks, a week and a half. It's March 1st, 2024. And the first thing I wanted to do was just kind of circle back for all of you guys and touch base on some of the things that I've been hearing out of Indy, kind of speculatory as far as big picture dominoes across the league. And I did have a chance to talk to a couple of folks within the league yesterday and kind of gauge the temperature, if you will, of some quarterback movement, for example, and some NFL draft hierarchy, for example. And I think the biggest thing that I came away with was this perceived race, I think, for simultaneously the third quarterback draft slot, wherever that's going to end up being available. I would not be surprised, just kind of based off what I'm hearing here in Indy, if there's not a preemptive trade to a hierarchy spot. And that's kind of dependent on the Patriots and their decision with what they're going to do. They've been reported all over the board, which I think is well played by Elliott Wolf and Gerard Mayo and that entire group. They have the pivot point of the first round in the same way that you go back to 2021, right? And it was the Dolphins that had the pivot point courtesy of the Houston Texans that year. And they traded out of that spot. And San Francisco comes up and puts themselves in a position to draft the third quarterback. And now you didn't necessarily love the results there, but there's that team every year. You can look at the draft order and say, well, that team kind of determines what the rest of the top 10 is going to look like because of their decision. And I think what makes New England the fascinating team this year is they too themselves could find themselves in a position to draft the quarterback. Do I think that they will? From what I've heard, I would be surprised if they did go quarterback, at least at this stage of the game. And we said at the beginning of the week, it's so hard to gauge where a team is going to go in the draft, even at the combine, just because there's so many things that have to happen between now and then. And they might be players in free agency for a quarterback, but it sounds like Baker Mayfield is going to end up going back to Tampa Bay. They sound, from what I've heard, they sound as though there's a pretty decent split between Baker's asking price and what Tampa's first offer was. So that may be a franchise tag candidate for Tampa Bay to retain Baker Mayfield and his services if they don't love the other quarterback options that are out there. And really, the only other one that you feel really good about as a starting quarterback, and when we did the free agency preview on the offensive side of the ball, was Kirk Cousins. And I've heard Kirk is going to have a robust market, and there's a handful of teams, and all the teams that you kind of hear are tied to J.J. McCarthy from a draft perspective feel like they're the quarterbacks that are also in the market for Kirk and his his services. Now, if one of those teams that you frequently hear tied to JJ McCarthy, I most frequently hear Atlanta and Minnesota. If one of those teams makes a preemptive move in the draft order, then that should tell you the domino has fallen the other way for Kirk Cousins. So that's just kind of how it's been painted to me out here in Indianapolis and kind of talking through. And I'm not really big on the insider stuff, right? Like I don't do news reporting, but I am at least sharing with you guys the perspective that I have and how it's been described to me from people that are more in the know from me. But this is all rumor mill stuff. It's smoke screen season, so you understand that coming in. You're not gonna now. When the next time I do a mock, you certainly have a chance to apply something new in a new scenario, and that's probably what I'll do when Joe comes back. I don't know if he's going to watch this before now and Monday when we do the first mock or the next mock, but if he doesn't, then that can be a nice little surprise for Joe. Is me coming out and say, "Hey, by the way, I want evens because I think Atlanta's 8 and Minnesota's 12, so I could do it either way." And try to make a big splash. So there's enough quarterback interest in the quarterbacks available that I do expect there to be some kind of splash. And the only thing that would prevent that is if the Patriots say, we're going to stand pat. Yikes. Oh, I'll drink. Sorry. Dad joke, pun intended. They'll stand pat and pick a quarterback at 3. The rest of the quarterback market, as far as prospects go, from what I've heard, some of the other popular names that you've seen in first rounds, it sounds like Michael Penix, the league's a little lower on than the external media mock draft consensus. I've heard he's a fringe top 100 type of candidate. I've heard Bo Nix is similarly a late day 2 value for many of the teams that this source that I had a chance to talk to had been able to gather. So maybe not status quo. There may be some surprise. And I don't know that Penix is too surprising because you have a medical background with an older player. I think that historically, even at quarterback, has made teams pretty gun shy. We're going to talk a little bit more about the testing, some of the interior guys, what they did. We got Tavondre Sweat. We got some other big fellas. We got some dudes that put up crazy numbers like Fiske out of Florida State. We're going to talk about them next here on this episode of Locked on NFL Scouting. Stick with us. Get buckets with your first bet over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. I'll tell you what, Braden Fiske had himself a day. The best recap that I could find came courtesy of Trevor Sikkema, former coworker at Draft Network, now with PFF. And it was the percentiles of the tests that Braden Fiske had posted. And Braden Fiske from Florida State came in and checked in at 6'3.5", and he checked in at 292 pounds. That is 61st and 16th percentile for interior defensive linemen. Okay, so it's modest. But then he ran a 4.78, which is 97th percentile for interior defensive linemen. And then he jumped 33.5 inches, which is 91st percentile for interior defensive linemen. And then he had a broad jump of 9 feet and 9 inches, which is 96th percentile for interior defensive linemen. Braden Fiske putting up these numbers is absolutely insane. The kind of explosiveness that he's been able to put on display. And There's only a handful of guys that were over 10 feet on the jumps on all the testing yesterday. Blew this absolutely positively out of the water. And I think as a player who you maybe thought was gonna be a midday 2 option, I got a hard time seeing that now. He also ran a short shuttle in 4.37 seconds, which is excellent agility. And his 10-yard split was a 1.68. For interior guys below 1.7's really good. So we checked every box. And then you watch the film and you saw the disruptiveness, and now you have elite athleticism to go with it, and he performed well at the Senior Bowl. This is one of those players that certain guys go through the pre-draft process and they make all the stops along the way and they check every single box. And when that happens, they usually get drafted pretty high. And I'm not saying Braden Fiske is going to be a first-round player, but with this athletic profile, this is a second-round pick at minimum now when you consider that he has good tape to go with it. So that's a really interesting development for like the discussion of the interior defensive line class. But he was not the only one who really helped himself from an interior defensive line standpoint. Now, I think there's a couple of guys that I come in and I have just as many questions as I did beforehand. And I think for me, that's probably where the conversation goes with T'Vondre Sweat. So T'Vondre Sweat came in, checked in at 366 pounds, didn't weigh at the NFL Combine. Had some people ask me, why is that an issue? But you elect not to weigh in at the All-Star event, which is unique. Usually indicates I want to get my weight in a better place for where I'm going to weigh in at. And then you come in and you weigh in. You don't cut to 340. You cut to what your listed playing weight was, which just makes me ask the question, what was your weight at the Senior Bowl, right? And for a 2-down nose tackle, which I like T'Vondre Sweat, I let me correct myself. I love T'Vondre Sweat. I think T'Vondre Sweat can be a 55% snap taker in the NFL. But if you cut to 366 and he had reasonably good size adjusted athletic testing, but just from a raw data perspective, he was among the lowest performers in the athletic testing. It does kind of create the question of, okay, what were the circumstances that led to a non-weigh-in and then 5 weeks later a weigh-in that was at your listed playing weight? So I think as long as there's proper questions that are asked for the teams, it doesn't have to be like the death knell for him by any means. But it's just a contrast versus some of the other guys in the interior defensive line class who came in and tested really well, like Byron Murphy from Texas. He came in and bowling ball type frame, but he ran a 4.87 with a 1.69 10-yard split. So again, under 1.7 is a really good time. He had a 33-inch vertical jump, which is a really strong time for a player of his stature and build, right around 300 pounds. So not the biggest, not the tallest, not the longest, not the heaviest of anchors, but he helped himself with the explosiveness which he illustrated. And you got Chris Jenkins from University of Michigan, who comes in and runs a 4.91 with a 1.70 10-yard split. 9.7 on the broad jumps, really good. That's a really good jump time. So good lower body explosiveness for him. He checked in at right at 300 pounds with 34-inch arms, so he had good length. He's got better length than the other guys that we've talked about this far as like actual wingspan and reach. So all these are the guys that are kind of in this middle tier class, not to mention some of the Clemson guys, not to mention Mekhi Wingo from LSU, who had himself a nice day as well with some good testing, 4.85 with a 1.64 10-yard split. Over 9 feet on the broad jump, 31.5 vertical. That really good athletic testing for guys, even at 285. You'd like him maybe a little denser and longer than what he checked in at. But nevertheless, it's still a strong performance. So just from an interior defensive line standpoint, I don't think T'Vondre Sweat helped himself. even though that, like, okay, like you ran well at 360, you ran very gracefully at 366. The conversation, the question that's invoked with a weigh-in that's exactly the same as what your listed playing weight was, and being less dynamically athletic than all of these other interior defensive linemen who were kind of regarded in a day two middle class, and they all tested really well. And some of these guys, like Braden Fiske, like blows it out of the water. I just think it's something um, for Tavondre Sweat that I think when you infuse that with kind of the questions about his role in the NFL level and how frequently he's actually going to be asked at the NFL level to rush the passer and what his snap count share is going to look like, I just come away from the combine with kind of a gut feeling that's a player that might be on the board a little bit longer than the general consensus had been, especially when you go back to like December, when you consider what the mock drafts had him as a back quarter of the first round type of player. I think that ship sailed. We'll talk about the edge group next here on this episode of Locked On NFL Scouting. So stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On NFL Scouting is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. Question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so that you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You can fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. Some of these edge guys, though, holy cow. Chop Robinson had himself a day of all days. Chop Robinson, 6'3", 254 pounds. Maybe wish he was a little longer, but he ran a 4.48. A sub 4.5 at 254 pounds with a 1.54 10-yard split. 1.54. Guys, that is flying. That is, and it's not that big of a surprise when you consider it's a Penn State player at the combine, and Happy Valley has Michael Jordan's secret sauce from Space Jam that they give these guys every year. It feels like there's a crazy tester from Penn State. Their strength and conditioning program does an outstanding job, but a 10.8 broad jump and a 1.54 for Chop Robinson at 254 pounds. I think that solidifies your profile as a back quarter of the first round type of player. There's a ton of teams in that area could use some pass rush help. There's no such thing as too many pass rushers. And it's not like he's in here at 235, 238, 242 pounds. He did it with the mass. I could think of a few guys that have done this that maybe were a little bit raw and they ended up sliding into day two. Like Josh Sweat's a good example of a guy who I think had similar explosiveness with a frame that was in the 250s. And he didn't get drafted particularly high, but I'll be darned if he's still not a really good player for the Philadelphia Eagles and has earned himself a featured role for that defense, at least in years past. We'll see what Vic Fangio brings. But that stands out to me. Dallas Turner, with the Wemby wingspan, it feels like just crazy long, had a really good day testing as well. You know, he at 247 pounds ran a 4.46, flying with a 1.54 10-yard split, flying vertical jump over 40 and a 10.7. So we don't have agility scores for him on NFL.com, but what we do have is the profile of a player who I think just staked his claim to be edge one in the class. I think that there were Leitu Latu was in the conversation. There's some other guys that I think are in the conversation, but Dallas, it's Jared Versus in this conversation as well. But Dallas having the length and having that explosiveness with tape that's good at Alabama against really good offensive linemen as frequently as it was on the schedule for University of Alabama, I think that's just enough different tiebreakers that he's probably going to get the nod. Because Jared Verse had a good day, but he didn't quite have the season that Dallas had this past season. Jared was a little bit more quiet. He had solid testing, but his agilities were kind of meh, which I think is the question. I think Verse is a little bit more of a power player, and Joe and I talk plenty about how power translates with no problem to the NFL level. And I don't have any questions about his ability to be a productive pass rusher and a productive 3-down player. And he ran well. He ran a 4.58. But that extra gear of explosiveness with more length that Dallas has, I think sets him up well. Whereas Latu, the medicals have always and will continue to be a question. He checked in at 260. He ran a 4.64. It's a good time. I thought the jumps would be better. I think that's something for me. He jumped 32 inches in the vert versus over 40 for Dallas, and a broad jump of 9.8 versus some of the other guys that we've talked about have been up over 10. Chop Robinson had him by a foot. That's enough for me when you consider requisite arm length, but not necessarily prototype arm length. I think that's enough for me to say I can see teams, whether it's right or wrong, or whether they're the better players or not, I could see teams deferring into the athletic profiles of guys that have had production more than Latu. So if you're a team in the 20s that wants a pass rusher, I think there's going to be a world where you get the chance to make the decision of, is Latu going to clear our medicals and going to be worth the risk? And if the answer is yes, then you could swing the bat. I think two guys that did not help themselves. The first one was Braden Trice. Braden Trice came in and weighed in at 245 pounds. And Braden Trice's whole thing was he was this dense pass rusher on the edge at Washington. And at 245, we ran a 4.72. It was the only thing he did. And to know that that's significantly leaner than what I think he looked on table when he was listed on the Washington roster, and he running the 4.7s, that just sets off some AJ Epinesa alarms. And Epinesa didn't cut until he got to Buffalo, but Epinesa was not a speed guy and then cut the weight, and the speed didn't come either. So that's the question I now have with Braden Trice coming out of the combine is, okay, you cut way down. You're lighter than Dallas Turner. You're lighter than Latu. You're lighter than Chop Robinson. You're lighter than all the top guys. And you were less dynamic. That's a concern. And the other one is Austin Booker, who's been really, really hot of a name. But he's another one who came in and did not necessarily run great at a lighter weight. He's 240 pounds and ran a 4.79. So I think you kind of saw the rising of that stock for Austin Booker. But then for you to kind of, I think this is a little bit of cold water on his stock that kind of reaffirms him as day two, like fringe top 100 type pass rusher type. So there's a lot of upside for him. He's still very young, but the lack of explosiveness as the smallest guy that we've talked about here is notable. And I don't think it's going to really help you when it's all said and done. So that is my initial knee-jerk reactions to some of the early testing from the defensive linemen. Shout out, we didn't really get into linebackers, but I would give every body part that I could to Payton Wilson if it was going to make him clear all the medicals with flying colors. That athletic testing was an absolute. Payton Wilson ran the fastest 40 time yesterday with a 4.43 official as a linebacker. Just outrageous. Outrageous testing, outrageous instincts. He is an absolute treat to watch on film. 233 pounds he ran that too. That's stupid good testing. And the film, like we said, the film's dominant too. So it's not like, oh, he's a good athlete. No, he's a good everything. He's just got medicals. It's first round, comfortable first round tape meets probably UDFA medical background. Now, maybe the medicals will be clear and he'll be fine, but several shoulder injuries, several knee injuries. It's not an easy decision, and I don't envy that decision the teams are going to have to make with him because it's going to be incredibly difficult. We have more combine testing coming your way today, so you can look forward to that. I'm Kyle Krabs. You can keep it locked in with us on Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We appreciate you guys for checking out the show. Enjoy the rest of the show here in Indianapolis. I know I certainly will. We'll be back to talk to y'all again soon. Peace.